Welcome to the Practice Discipleship webinar initiative and series. My name is Dawn Troutman. I'll be your host throughout this series. You can maybe have met me at the Extravaganza or some other kind of Lutheran youth worker places, but you can find out more about me at my website, dawntroutman.com. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation, and this year's theme is Wonder. There will be a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. Today's webinar is titled Wondering with Children and Youth, and our presenter today is Jeremy Myers. He is the Associate Professor of Children and Youth. I'll have to verify that with him at Augsburg College. But before we go to Jeremy, please take a moment to notice the box. It's on the left side of your screen today. It's often been on the right. This is where you can ask questions and make comments, and we integrate everybody's comments and questions as we go along. So please do take note of that box, and I will, when it's in the flow of our conversation, I'll ask those questions of Jeremy so that you can get answers and be a part of the discussion. So with that housekeeping aside, welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. But I'm not seeing anything change on my screen.
No, I just noticed that. So Chris is our awesome behind-the-scenes person, and I'm checking with him. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Chris.
Imagine.
Yay. I know, I'm glad you said something.
No problem. I just assumed it was my fault. It usually is.
No.
All right, great.
So,
good to be here.
Now,
Hello, everyone
now that we have the
there.
pictures.
Yeah, now we have pretty pictures to look at. My name's Jeremy Myers. I teach at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, which is an amazing place. I teach in the religion department, oversee the college's youth and family ministry degree program, and I've been working with Practice Discipleship since its beginning, so it's always fun to get to do these things. I wish I could see all of you out there rather than just speaking to my computer, but nonetheless, let's do this thing. This session is on thinking theologically with children and youth, or wondering with children and youth, and I have come to believe in my teaching and training of people for youth and family ministry is that one of the most important things, and I would say one of the most practical things we can do for our young people is to help them think theologically about their lives. So this session is going to help you understand what it means to think theologically, and it will also give you some practical ideas on how you might do that with kids. So to get started here, let's pause for a moment, and what I want you to do is just take a second to ponder this question that's in front of you, and maybe jot down a few things that come to mind. So what would you say it means to think theologically? Take maybe 1 minute, just jot some things down for yourself. We're not going to discuss these. I just want you to start wrapping your own head around this. What does it mean to you to think theologically?
I love it. What answers have you heard in the past, Jeremy?
Most people think that it means most people think that it means memorizing Luther, Bonhoeffer, people like that, and then pulling it out at just the right time.
I love it.
So, yeah. So I want you to be a little honest about your own presuppositions about theology. Most people are intimidated by it, but I am of the belief that we are all theologians. We are all thinking theologically whenever we are pondering God and God's work in this world. And it's not something we need to be intimidated by. It's something we need to be, in which we should be willing to be vulnerable and authentic and to try to do a little more intentionally. So there are 4 points I want to make. to develop this argument. And to start with, we're going to look at a key point that Andy Root makes in his book, Christopraxis. This is the first point I really want to make in thinking what it means to think theologically. Thinking theologically is, first and foremost, thoughtful reflection on God's action in the world. This is the main point that Andy makes in this book, Christopraxis. You got a picture of the cover right there. It's a dense, fairly complicated book, but worth the read if you're up to the challenge. But this is essentially the argument that he's making, is that all theology is always reflection on God's action first. So God is the one who is doing the ministry. We are not the ones doing ministry. God is the one who's doing the ministry. God is the one who's bringing about redemption and healing and forgiveness. And we are the ones who are fortunate enough to get to notice that and reflect on it. So that's what it means to be a theologian, is to reflect on God's ministry, to reflect on the way in which God is healing people in the moment. So the first thing to keep in mind about what it means to think theologically is that it's always action, it's always thoughtful reflection on God's action, and that God's action in the world doesn't start with our own theological work. God's action is the first thing. So God acts first, we reflect on it. God is the minister, we are the theologians who get to notice and interpret God's ministry in our world. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The next point I want to make is covered in this book, The Cross in Our Context, which looks like, the cover looks like something out of Jesus Christ Superstar or something like that.
I'm very glad you referenced a musical. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. That was for you, Dawn. All for you.
Thank you.
This book's written by Douglas John Hall, who's a Canadian theologian who has done a lot of writing on theology of the cross and how the theology of the cross can help us think theologically about the contexts that we are planted in. So the second point that we want to make about theology is that it is the process of discerning and proclaiming good news that will actually displace someone's bad news. And I say this phrase all the time because I think it's so powerful. If we want to proclaim good news to people, then we have to first do the hard work of learning what their bad news is, so that we can proclaim the good news in a way that it actually is good, and it actually does displace the person's or the community's bad news. So first, thinking theologically means reflecting on God's ministry, God's action in the world. Second, it means proclaiming God's action in the world, proclaiming good news in a way that actually will displace and address and displace someone's bad news. Now we'll move on to the third point that I want to make. The third point is this idea of weaving together stories. So thinking theologically involves the weaving together of God's stories and our stories. And I would even say, when we say "our," it makes it sound like we're all the same. And actually, I would say it's a weaving together of God's stories and a gazillion stories that are incredibly different from one another. And it's weaving together the story of creation as well, the story of communities, the stories of people, people who've been displaced, people who have been oppressed, people who have been forgotten, people who have been massacred. So thinking theologically is the weaving together of stories that are familiar to us and stories that are incredibly unfamiliar to us, and listening within those stories for God's action, for God's ministry, and finding ways to weave those together, just as a master weaver, like the gentleman in this picture, would take all these threads and weave them together into a masterpiece of tapestry that at the beginning just looks like chaos, but in the end it's absolutely beautiful. And it's not about taking all of those stories and bleaching the color out of them so they're all the same. It's actually about recognizing and honoring and utilizing the difference in those stories and recognizing the beauty in those differences. So the third point here is about thinking theologically is that it's a weaving together of stories. It's not just academic mumbo jumbo. And the last point I want to make about what it means to think theologically comes from an educational theorist from Brazil. His name is Paulo Freire. He's pictured here. I have a little beard envy whenever I see this picture of him. And his primary work is this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he's talking about, in this book, he talks about a process he used to educate poor, rural, mostly illiterate Brazilian farmers. And he wanted to teach them to read, and he wanted to organize them for political power so that they could live better as people. And he talks in this book about how education is always for either domestication or liberation or praxis. And I'll say a little bit more about praxis here in a minute. But that the educational process, whether you're teaching math, whether you're teaching how to play soccer, or whether you're teaching them faith, is always about either domestication or praxis. We're either domesticating them into a set of, into a system that should be, should not be questioned, that should be just taken at face value, and that they should sort of find, find their place in that system and play their role and just go along with it without asking any hard questions. That's domestication. And praxis or liberation would be to see education as power that liberates people, that causes them to question the system and wonder if there's a better life for those who are being oppressed by this system of domestication. So you can, I hope you're already thinking about maybe confirmation or Sunday school or the ways we worship or anything else that we do in the church right now, because I think not only is education always either for domestication or liberation, I would say discipleship is always for one of those two things. We're either discipling people into a system of domestication that really does not necessarily result in any type of meaning or purpose, or we're discipling them into praxis or liberation, which allows them to take their core beliefs, their core theological convictions, and put those things into action. A ministry of domestication is interested in getting kids on a committee so kids can learn how to be committee members. A process of discipleship for liberation or praxis is helping them understand how their theological core convictions should impact the way they live their lives in the community. So the fourth point of thinking theologically is that it should always be towards praxis, towards liberation, and not towards domestication.
Which
so those are the
we have
four.
such a history of that.
What's that?
We have such a history of, theological thought being used for domestication. I've just never heard that term for it. I love it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We've had a history of it, and it's because Christianity has always been the norm, at least in the United States.
Yes.
Then we never question domestication because it's normal, right? Like the best thing we can do supposedly is domesticate or socialize these people into what's already considered normal and socially acceptable. Well, that's not the case anymore,
Right.
And we're starting to finally realize how what we considered to be normal has actually been really damaging to some people. And so we can either be honest about that or we can continue to lie about it.
Hmm.
Um,
Let's look at those two options.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
You can either
also,
lie about it, or you can be honest with it. But the I don't think young people today, I don't think young people really ever were interested in being domesticated into anything.
mhm.
Um, and so it just,
Individualism and action are they ring much truer for young people.
yeah, meaning and purpose, absolutely. So
Yeah.
these are the four key points that we just went over.
Great.
Um,
Amanda has one question about number two, so I'm glad that they're on there. Number two is the discerning and proclaiming good news that displaces bad news, for those of you listening and you don't have your eyes on the screen. And she asked if you could go into more detail about that point. She's having a hard time seeing past the pick and choose theology and the way it was explained.
ah, the pick and choose theology. Um,
Do you need more from Amanda?
yeah, I'd like to know what she means by that.
Awesome. She's like, hopefully you know what I mean because I'm not sure how else to put it. We don't, Amanda, but we want to know what you
Yeah,
mean. So
yeah.
please type a little more so that Jeremy can unpack that a little for you. But why don't you go on and then I'll jump in once Amanda has a chance to type a little more.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll start saying a little bit about that, and I'm going to assume I might know what she means, but
Okay.
um, I think discerning and proclaiming good news that displaces bad news requires us to start with a person or a community of people's story, hearing their story, learning how it is that they're actually experiencing bondage or brokenness in their own lives, where they experience fear, suffering, anxiety. Then we have a better idea of how we might proclaim good news. Then we have an idea of how, once we have an idea of how they're experiencing bondage, then we have an idea of how we might proclaim how the gospel can liberate them. So it's not, in a way, it's picking and choosing, but at the same time, I don't like the term picking and choosing. I like the term discernment
Mm-hmm.
because discernment implies the need to sort of sift through the stories that you're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's not, and Douglas John Hall in some of his other writings talks about how hearing the truth or the good news is not always it's not necessarily just blowing sunshine at people. That sometimes the truth the way there's another book, I can't remember the name of it, that I just used this semester, and they talk about how we have our we have our needs and our wants, and then we also have our reorganized needs. And so
Mm.
sometimes, and maybe this is what Amanda's asking about, we're not necessarily doing picking and choosing between wants and needs. Sometimes the gospel actually reorganizes our needs. So the things we think that we're experiencing that are suffering and bondage actually really aren't, because the gospel sometimes reorganizes or rearranges those wants and those needs. So most of us can distinguish between wants and needs, but this thought of reorganized needs is really hard for us to think about until it's actually happened to us. So I don't know
Awesome.
if Amanda's gotten back to you or not.
Well, she just said she wanted some time to think about it. So that was helpful to me and hopefully started to frame some of her thinking. Thank you for
Yeah,
going into that.
the simple point I'm trying to make, and I think Douglas John Hall makes, is that if we believe that Jesus Christ is good news, then we would actually want Jesus Christ and that good news of the gospel to truly transform lives. Um, and
Awesome.
and so that implies the need to actually understand the life.
And she said what you said made sense. So good.
Great.
She wrote, it's more for figuring a way to proclaim the good news, not which pieces to tell them. The way it settled in my brain before sounded like figuring out what they needed to hear to cancel out the bad news. Sounds like almost like a prescription or something, but
Yeah, right.
we're just saying how to do it, the manner in which it is done.
Yeah, and I also want to note that we Hall says displace rather than cancel out. So there's this,
Mm.
and we all have experienced this, right? The gospel comes in and transforms our suffering. It doesn't eliminate it. It displaces it. It might shove it aside. It might not be the primary experience anymore, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate it. It's not gone. It's just no
Right.
longer the primary thing.
Right. Because something else is bigger, the good news.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's
Thank
keep
you.
going, but
We'll keep
everybody
going.
jump in. This is what we want. Thank you, Amanda, and anyone else who's thinking about writing in.
So those are the four ways I want to describe what it means to think theologically. Now I want to give you, well, we'll transition by doing a little Bible story here, and then I'll give you some practical ways you can start doing some of this stuff with your young people. Okay? So story time with Jeremy here.
Love it.
This is the Call of Samuel. Most of you will be familiar with this story. And if your eyes are good enough to follow along with it on the screen, feel free to do that. If not, you can just close your eyes and imagine the story playing out in your mind. Unless you're listening to this while you're driving, then keep your eyes open.
Thank you. Public service announcement.
Public service announcement. So here's the Call of Samuel, and I highlighted some words there that have to do with the senses, and that will all make sense in a moment. So listen to this story. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At the time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli. And he said to Eli, Here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But Eli said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again, a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make, and I love this. He says, See, and then he says, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever, for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. This is not good news for Eli. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. Here I am, Eli said. The boy has learned well, right? What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told Eli everything and hid nothing from him. Then Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. So there are three things. This is a really, really rich, powerful story worth spending some more time on. But there are three things I want to highlight. The first thing is that it's a great example. Every young person is a Samuel who needs an Eli. And so Eli is helping Samuel think theologically here, which means thinking about God's ministry or God's action in the world. God was an active agent in this story, And Eli's job was to help Samuel see that and understand that. So our role with young people is similar to Eli's role here. That's the first thing I want to point out. The second thing I want to point out is that when our Eli's help us as Samuels to think theologically, then we start to hear and see things differently. And that's why I highlighted some of these words. I think they're in red. I don't know. I'm colorblind. Could be green. Anyway, the words
Kind
that are
of reddish, yellowish, something-ish.
yeah, they're reddish, yellowish, something-ish. Exactly. That's what I was looking for. But
Yeah.
you notice eyesight grows dim. The lamp of God had not gone yet out. The Lord was calling. And then God says, see, I'm doing something new that's going to make the ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. So there's all these things about hearing and seeing. So as we learn to think about God and understand, as we learn to ponder God's action in the world, we learn to hear things and see things differently. Visions were rare, it says, but the lamp of God had not gone out. So people were having a hard time seeing God at work, but that doesn't mean God was not at work. People were having a hard time hearing God, but that does not mean God was not speaking. So think of every young person you encounter as a Samuel. Think of yourself as an Eli. You can probably even name the people who've been Elis for you, who have helped you hear and respond to God's call in your life. Here's the third thing I want to point out, though. It doesn't turn out well for Eli, right? At the end of this text, Eli gets some pretty bad news. And this is troubling, and not the way we like to think about God working. But this is the point I want to make. Eli, I can only imagine that Eli had a hunch that this wasn't going to turn out well for him. I'm sure Eli knew the iniquity of his house that God references later at the end of this text. So, but here's the thing. Eli's call was to help Samuel hear God's call in Samuel's own life. And what I wonder is, are we, as a quote-unquote adult church, willing to allow our young people to reflect so deeply on God's action in the world and God's call for their lives? Are we willing to do that even if it results in them turning back to us and saying, hey folks, you've messed up? Just like Samuel does here with Eli. Samuel learns how to hear God. Eli teaches Samuel how to hear God, and then Samuel turns to Eli and says, dude, you messed up. And
It's rather threatening.
It's rather threatening. It's scary. And so then are we willing as a church to allow our young people to engage God's action in the world in a way that's so profound and so meaningful and so real that we're even willing to allow that to result in some bad news for us? Are we willing to do that? Because I think that's the level at which we need to be committed to this work. So, end of Bible story with Jeremy. Now I want to move on to the practical, unless there are any quick questions.
Jens has one. If the church is to survive, we must not dim the guiding and sometimes probing light of youth. It's more of a comment. Thank you, Jens.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, Eli did not have to teach Samuel to hear God in order for Samuel to hear God. Samuel was hearing God. Eli needed to teach Samuel to understand that the experience he was having was a God experience.
Put a framework. Yes. Yeah. Help interpret what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. The lamp of God has not yet gone out.
Right. But how many churches are afraid of that? So I'd love for you to move to the practical.
Yeah, let's do that. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is a way of wondering with children and youth. And I would say children and youth of all ages, even children and youth who are 80 years old. This is a way of wondering with them. And many of you have probably experienced the Ignatian Awareness Examen. I will walk you through a bit of it just so you get a sense of what it's like. And there's a handout that goes with this presentation that will be available on the Practice Discipleship Facebook page as soon as this webinar is over. And the handout, I'm going to walk you through 3 things you can do with children and youth in your congregation. And the handout will give you more detailed instructions on how to do these 3 things.
Awesome. And if you're just quickly, sorry, if you're listening after the fact, if you scroll down below this video, you'll also see the link there to get the handout.
Great. Thanks, Dawn.
Yep.
So the first thing I want to talk about is the awareness examen. And Martin Heidegger is a philosopher who at one time he wrote, he talked about frameworks. He was talking about frameworks and the way of understanding the world. And he talked about how optimism and pessimism are childish categories, and he'd rather people learn how to use the categories of sin and hope rather than optimism and pessimism. And I remember reading that for the first time, and it really caused me to rethink a common practice of youth ministry that I was using, which was highs and lows. And I think Heidegger would look at highs and lows. What's that, Don?
That's just, it's so ingrained that you do that. The highs and lows of the day.
Yeah.
Or yay God, right?
Yep.
Yay God.
Yep. Well, my low is I had a test today. My high is that tomorrow's Saturday. So Heidegger would say optimism and pessimism, or highs and lows, are perpetuate childish categories, and they might be appropriate at one point, but eventually we sort of have to grow out of thinking about life experiences in terms of the best moments and the worst moments. And this is one way we can help our young people think theologically. Rather than framing life in terms of highs and lows, we can frame life in terms of sin and hope. And I think the awareness examen helps us do that. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the examen is, and then we're going to do it.
We have one listener who said they once found out about a youth member's dad dying from highs and lows. So think about a low and a high. Those categories just don't even begin to fit when something really big happens.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, your father dying is way more than a low.
Right.
And I'm not trying to say that doing highs and lows with kids is bad. What I'm encouraging us to do is thinking about this common practice in youth ministry as an opportunity to frame life theologically. So rather than thinking about it as the best thing and worst thing that's happened to me, we can think about these in other terms. So the awareness examen...
I'm sorry I keep interrupting you. I apologize. We have all these wise people. Nick wrote, we moved away from highs and lows to where did you see the Holy Spirit this week, and what is the most exciting thing happening in your life right now? So that's a little wider.
Yep.
Thank you, Nick.
And by asking that question, Nick, you're putting God into the equation. Just by saying, where did you see the Holy Spirit move this week? So now what happens when you do this is the kids are going to be thinking about their experience in those terms, in that framework. So they're going to be, things will be happening and they're going to be wondering, is this the Holy Spirit or not, right? Mm-hmm. And whether they have a clear answer to that, I don't think that totally matters right now. What matters is that they're pondering it. They're wondering about it.
They're thinking theologically.
They're thinking theologically. So, the awareness examen was developed by Ignatius of Loyola in the 1500s. He used this with his Jesuits. And it was a way, they would pray it twice a day, and it's a way of praying over your day. And it's used across Christianity now. So it was historically a Catholic prayer practice, but now Protestants have discovered and think it's the best thing since sliced bread. So
we love to do that.
Yeah, we love to do that. So these, I think, are the 3 things that it accomplishes. The awareness examen helps us develop eyes to see and ears to hear God at work in our world. It helps us hear and see God at work in our world through both sin and hope. So it's not just naming highs and lows, but it's wondering about how God is present and active in those highs and in those high moments and in those low moments. And over time, or not over time, but over time, it changes our very being. It converts us into people who expect to see God working in our world in strange and mysterious ways. Or what I like to say is it makes us do our homework. So if I have a group of people who will ask me on a weekly basis, where have I experienced sin and hope this week, then I'm going to have to do my homework. During the week, I'm going to be thinking about the encounters and the experiences I have in those terms, wondering if these experiences fit those categories. So if I know someone's going to ask me, I'm going to have to do my homework, which means I'm going to be thinking about it during the week. And that's
I
really
love
what
it.
we want our young people to learn.
Jason added another thing that we have borrowed from our Catholic friends. Jesuits use, where did you see God today, and where did you need to see God today? Thank you, Jason.
So now I want to just walk you through, on the next slide, I'll walk you through the steps of the exam. And there are plenty of wrong ways to do this, but there isn't really a right way to do it, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so I just want to, if you've never experienced this, I want to walk you through these steps. And I'm also going to remind you that this is all in the handout that you can get after this webinar. So you don't need to be writing this down or anything. If you want to follow along by reading the screen while I'm doing this, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I encourage you to close your eyes, and I'll just guide you through this. And we'll practice the exam in briefly here, just for a couple minutes. I always start by saying that posture matters. So if you're sitting in a chair, sit with your feet floor and your spine straight. Maybe place your hands in your lap. And then I'll ask you to sit quietly with your eyes closed for a little while and take long, deep breaths and allow your muscles just to relax, just to settle into the chair. And as you're ready, I'm going to ask you to prayerfully look back over today since you woke up this morning. Where today have you encountered sin or brokenness or suffering in your life? Where have you seen or experienced sin, suffering, or brokenness today? And just allow that moment to come to mind, to come to your heart. And once you've thought of that moment, spend some time pondering what was going on in that moment and how God might have been at work in that situation. And then again, I ask you to prayerfully look back over today in the same way, asking God to help you see moments or a moment when you encountered hope or healing or new life in your experiences today. And once you've identified that moment, spend some time pondering what was going on and how God was at work in that situation. And as you end, just express your gratitude to God for God's presence and action in your life and for this time of reflection and prayer. And then we'll move on. All right, I'm assuming some of you did that. Thanks for doing that with me. It's very odd to lead this in in this format. And if you notice the point 8 at the bottom of your screen there, it says when practicing with a group, give the members a chance to share their moments with one another. So you might pause after talking about suffering and sin and allow them to share their moments, and then you might move on to hope and healing and allow them to share their moments. And there are a lot of ways you can get creative with this. They can draw pictures, they can write poems, journal, they can strike poses. I've done that before with kids who just needed to be up and moving around. You know, I would ask them to strike a pose that represented the place or the way they experienced suffering, strike a pose that represented the way they experienced hope. And if you do this over and over and over again with a group of people, one, they grow closer together. They start to understand one another's struggles and needs for prayer. But two, they also start developing a theological framework, which means a way of looking for God at work in the world. Their ears, I would say, to go back to the Samuel text, their ears start tingling. So the Awareness Examine is one way of helping young people start to think theologically. And not just young people, all people. There's a great book that I would also refer to you called Sleeping with Bread. It's maybe 60 pages long. It's kind of written for children, but it's great for adults too. And it's a great introduction to the Awareness Examine. So I commend it.
Wonderful.
And
This book, it will be linked on the Facebook page and on our Twitter and all of that. But also the last two books that you referenced by Andy Root and also Douglas John Hall, those are already there on the Facebook page and the Twitter feed. And of course, after the fact, they will be on the replay page. So there's 3 good books and maybe more. Who knows? We have 15 minutes. You could come up with all kinds of books.
I'll work on that.
Thank you.
So that's wondering. That's one way of doing prayerful wondering and helping young people think theologically, sort of on a daily basis. Now I want to talk about the next exercise, which is simply the exercise of asking hard questions or wondering about God and life. Great story. 2 great stories. First, a story about my dad. My dad died almost a year ago, and due to complications, died from complications due to Alzheimer's. And so he spent the last couple years of his life in and out of senior care facilities. And he was at one care facility for a while, and they had a woman volunteer coming in to lead Bible study on a weekly basis. And one day, and she was really excited. My dad's a Lutheran pastor, so you should know that. And one day she was leading a Bible study, and she was trying to get people to talk about a time when they experienced Christ's love in their life. And no one was talking, and no one was sharing, so she asked my dad what he thought about that, and they all called him Reverend in the home. And so she said, Reverend Bob, what do you think about that? Can you tell us a time? Tell us about a time when you experienced Jesus' love in your life. And my dad just looked at her straight in the eyes, and he said, what does this mean? And if any of you have taught Luther's Small Catechism, you're familiar with that question, right? So I found that I found that really profound because, in his final months of battling Alzheimer's, he couldn't sing hymns. He couldn't remember how to take communion at church. He couldn't remember words for prayers, but he remembered that question, and he asked it at an appropriate time, which I just thought was absolutely amazing. And that's sort of what we're getting at here. So that's a story about my life. Now a story about Martin Luther. Luther uses this question in the Small Catechism, what does this mean? That question comes from watching his toddler move around the house and constantly touching things and grabbing things and looking at things on the ground and asking the question, what is this? Was ist das? What is this? What is this? What is this? And if you've ever been around a toddler, you hear them doing that all the time, right? What is this? What? What is this? Why? What?
Why is the big...
Yeah, why? Why? What is this? What does that mean? You know, go to your room. What does that mean? And so the Lutheran theology has always sort of been more about asking that question than about finding a particular answer. And I think we need to remember that as we talk about thinking theologically, and we need to encourage our young people to not only ask tough questions, but also wrestle with trying to answer those tough questions. So I give some examples here on the next slide, and we're not going to read over all of this. I'm just going to encourage you to do this work with your young people and their families, but I encourage you to encourage them to really start wrestling with what they actually believe in. And I think the key is crafting good questions that will help them do that. If we just say, tell me what you believe about God, that might not be a helpful question. But if we ask them, how would you describe God to a friend who does not believe in God, then that question has more legs to it. So you might take one question a week and spend time with giving your students time to sort of write about this and talk about it with one another and process it, and go home and talk to their families about it and come back and process it as a group. So asking really hard questions, encouraging them to ask and wrestle with really hard questions about who God is, what it means to be a human being, and how God interacts with human beings. What is heaven? Who gets to go there? You know, and just it's not a test. You're not expecting them to, you're not telling them to find the right answer, but you're encouraging them to really wrestle with these hard questions and spend some time wondering what they actually believe in. Spend some time wondering what these things actually mean. So that's, you know, a really simple thing you can do with high school kids, middle school kids, even children. If you phrase the questions appropriately, it's something they can be doing with their families as well. And then the third thing I want to share with you, this is not rocket science, just so you know. I'm not a super creative person. I just like to ask questions, and I think you can do that too. But sometimes those of us who work with children and youth need to be given permission to simply wrestle with questions with them rather than you know, teaching to the test, essentially. That's not something
Which would be domestication.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dawn.
Bringing it back for you.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Domestication is saying, here are the answers to these questions, but really what we want them to do is ask the questions and wrestle with the questions, not just... Sometimes we do this in our practice. We'll have a question night where kids can ask the pastor any question they might have. And that's not a bad thing to do, because hopefully the pastor will model a Lutheran theological process in handling those questions. But unfortunately, sometimes it sets up this situation where it seems like the pastor actually has the answer. And sometimes the pastor does have the answer, but not always.
Mhm.
And it's not
Mhm.
always about having the answer. Sometimes it's just about asking the question, what does this mean? And I go back to my dad's story, at the end of his life, when he can't remember words to a song, to hymns, he can't remember words to prayers, he can't remember even how to take communion. He can remember that question. And that
Right.
gave me a lot of hope in those moments. So
Mhm.
so the next thing we can do is this practice of wondering about good news or encountering death and resurrection. And this is sort of putting the awareness examine and our theological convictions, those questions we just went through, it's putting those two things together into sort of a discernment exercise about how we live out the good news in our daily lives. And I have a very boring but practical um, chart or table on the next slide. This is a much better, this is more interesting to look at, the flower growing out of the crack, than this slide I have now in front of you. But I hope that you can make this, a more creative person can make this look prettier than I can. But basically, it's working through with your young people this process. First, hearing the bad news, the left-hand column, engaging in brokenness, list ways people in your community experience brokenness and bad news. So if you've been practicing the awareness examine with them for a while, they'll get that question. They'll know what you're talking about. Where do you see suffering in our community? Where are people experiencing brokenness? And then if you've been doing those tough questions with them, they can do the second step, which is the middle column, or core beliefs. Which of your core beliefs address these experiences of brokenness? And then the third step, again, if you've been doing the awareness examine with them, they'll be able to do this. What would this core belief have to look like or sound like in order to be good news for those experiencing brokenness in this way? So I'm going to use as an example racism. List ways that people in your community are experiencing brokenness and bad news. In my community here in the Twin Cities right now, it's a lot of racism. That is an experience of brokenness and bad news that tears at me on a daily basis. And what core beliefs address the experiences of brokenness? I would probably have to go back to my beliefs in dignity, and that God, can we treat people this way, and how can we set up systems that dehumanize an entire race of people when we believe that when we have this belief in a divine sense of human dignity. And then what would the good news have to look like or sound like? I think divine news would, or the good news would have to look and sound like me honoring these stories of real people and real communities and how they're really experiencing suffering. It would look like me believing what they're telling me. Even though it might be hard for me to believe that they're telling me they're experiencing, it would look like and it would sound like me believing those stories. And then the fourth step is the question of call. Given what you've discovered in this exercise, who is God calling us to be, and what is God calling us to do? Which, in the example I just gave, I would probably start thinking about, well, maybe we're being called as a church to confess our own utilization of racist systems and our own personal racism. Maybe it looks like us making a commitment to doing hard work of learning more about systemic racism, learning more about privilege, and I think it would also start to look like us working intentionally at building relationships across differences so that lives can truly be changed and systems can truly be changed. So wondering about good news is putting together what we've learned in the awareness exam and what we've learned about asking hard questions, putting those things into a process of wondering about how we go proclaim the good news in the midst of these things. My hope is that we get to the place where our young people can just think about these things sort of on the fly, as maybe not how quickly it happens, but I want them to be thinking about these things in real time. I want them to be noticing brokenness when it happens and wondering about how their core beliefs are calling them into action in that moment.
So that they can take action instead of it being always in the past.
Yeah, so they can take action, but so that they also begin to understand how their action is related to God's action, how they recognize that God is always the first actor, and our reflection on God's action in the world shapes the way we imagine ourselves in the world and changes the way we live in the world.
I love it. I want to make sure you get one more kind of closing statement before we do our final housing things. We've gotten to such a huge place, but
yeah,
bring it back around for us.
Oh, geez. Well, I want to resist bringing it back around because I want to encourage you to look at the handouts and imagine how you would take those and imagine how you would use those in your setting. And I would encourage you I've been teaching at Augsburg now for 10 years, and when I started here, I really thought I needed to show everyone how much I knew. And what I've learned in the 10 years of teaching college is that class is way more interesting when I allow time and space for the students to really wonder and ask questions and then wrestle with their own questions. Class is not productive when I get up in front of people and tell them how much I know. And so I guess the word I'd want to leave you with is that don't be afraid of those questions. Don't be afraid of going to that place of wondering, because I believe it's in those places where God's at work creatively, and we get to be there. That's our call. That's our expectation, is to help our young people wonder in those ways. So don't feel like you need to fill the time with pre-printed curriculum. Nothing against pre-printed curriculum, but don't feel like you need to fill the time with that. I mean, allow there to be space for wondering and reflection. That's what I'd end with.
Thank you, and that is a big, bold move, because then you just don't know where it's going to go.
Exactly, and that's why
very
we
exciting.
Don't go there. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for this, Jeremy. It was so fun to just go in a really big, really deep direction about wondering. So a couple quick reminders as we wrap up. This webinar, along with all the others in the series, has been recorded and archived on the Practice Discipleship website. I mentioned a couple times that's where you can find the downloads of these books. It's practicediscipleship.org. So please do download things. Use it with anyone in your congregation, your neighborhood, random teenagers you've met on the street. Everyone is welcome to access this and benefit from this. You can also download from the Practice Discipleship site videos and curriculum from previous years to use in your congregation and networks. Each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars that are on the same topics of these webinars. So that's a local live event in your own synod. Training events also on that website, so keep checking back for updates. You can also find event dates on the network app for iPhone and Android. So this free app gives you anytime access to videos, network news, calendar of events, an interactive prayer wall, and much more. I also mentioned we have a Facebook page and a Twitter feed. So for Facebook, just search, excuse me, the Practice Discipleship Initiative, and Twitter is at ELCAPD. Coming this Tuesday is the Third Tuesday Conversation, and it's with Andrew Zerke. I should meet Andrew and find out how to say his last name. I apologize. He is the Assistant Professor of Practical Theology and Youth Ministry at Memphis Theological Seminary and serves as Academic Director at the Center for Youth Ministry Training in Brentwood, Tennessee. And he is going to talk about a book that I actually really enjoyed, so if you can get to that conversation, please do. It's called Beyond the Screen, Youth Ministry for the Connected but Alone Generation. We'll be taking a summer break from these webinars, so our next webinar isn't until Thursday, September 8th at 1 o'clock Central. And the title for that is Wondering About Confirmation with Terry Elton. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you in September, and have a wonderful next few months of ministry, and we will see you soon. And thank you again, Jeremy.
You're welcome. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.